Most people assume that once they've accumulated enough money, the hard part is over. But lately, I found myself in conversations that kind of suggest the opposite. And that's exactly what we're going to get at in today's video. I'm going to be walking through an article that I've written that talks about that exact thing. So without further ado, let's hop into it. Is whole life insurance worth it if you already have a large 401k? And more specifically, I'm talking about overfunded whole life insurance, high cash value whole life insurance. That's exactly what we're going to be getting at because we're looking to accumulate assets within that whole life insurance policy to be used at some point in the future, or probably even near term if you want to as well. So let's hop into it, okay? So if you've done a good job saving and investing over the years, but you've started to wonder whether a large 401k is enough on its own for retirement, this conversation will be relevant for you. One of the most common misconceptions I encounter is the belief that once someone accumulates a large retirement account balance, that planning is entirely finished. And I would underline this and then kind of just like cross it out and say that the planning is not entirely finished, right? Because in reality, many of the most successful savers I meet eventually begin asking a different set of questions altogether, okay? So recently, I had a conversation with a very successful professional who's already accumulated more than $1 million in his 401k alone. And yet he still found himself exploring whole life insurance. And by the way, just to give you a little bit of context, he's in his mid-40s, right? Now, at first glance, this may not seem like it makes a lot of sense, but the reason why reveals something I think many people overlook when it comes to retirement planning or just future cash flow planning, right? Distribution planning, right? And so if you've done a good job saving for retirement and you've accumulated a substantial balance inside of your 401k, first and foremost, I want to say congratulations to that because you're in a small subset of people who have actually been able to do that. But you may have also been in that position where you're asking yourself a very, very reasonable question, which is, why would I consider whole life insurance? Like, I've heard some buzz about whole life insurance. Maybe I've seen some reels, maybe I've seen some TikToks or whatever that may be. Maybe you've seen things right here on YouTube, but you've seen some things about whole life insurance and you're asking yourself, why would I consider whole life insurance? And you started to do a little bit of digging. And so I think that's a good question to ask. Because after all, isn't the goal to build enough assets so that the additional planning becomes unnecessary? Like, that's kind of like the big question. People believe that once they've accumulated enough, all of the additional planning becomes unnecessary and it's going to be quote unquote easy. But like I've said in prior videos, climbing up the mountain is not the same as getting down the mountain. The tools and strategies that you've used to accumulate and make it to retirement are not the same tools and strategies that you use to get down the mountain. Otherwise, in other words, getting to a point where you have the cash flow that you're looking to have, that's adjusted for inflation, that covers Medicare costs, that does all these things. I think that's important. So anyways, more recently, I had a conversation with a successful electrical engineer. Again, like you said, he's in his mid to late 40s, and he was approximately earning $400,000 per year. He had $1.2 million in his 401k. He had some additional assets in brokerage accounts. He had company stock. He had multiple sources of future retirement income through pension and other retirement benefits as well. And so by the standards of most people, he was doing exactly everything that he should be doing. And by the standards of most people, he's pretty successful. Now, I would agree with that because he has done everything right. He has done a lot of great things. He has accumulated a fair amount of capital inside of his 401k, and he's only in his mid-40s. The interesting part was that he wasn't looking for another investment. And that matters a lot because I'll say it now, and I may say it a little bit later as well, whole life insurance, high cash value whole life insurance, no matter how you slice it, is not an investment. It's a place to store capital, and it can amplify or make better or enhance the other assets that you have within your portfolio. And as you're taking risk in other places, you're being stable within whole life insurance. And so it actually almost can give you more permission to be risky in other areas. But that's a sidebar. I'll digress from that point for now. But my client here, he wasn't looking for a way to outperform the stock market. That's not what he's looking to do. He wasn't looking to replace his 401k. That's not what he was looking to do. In fact, he planned on continuing to contribute to it, right? What he was trying to solve for was a different problem entirely. And so as we reviewed his overall financial picture, and I would say this part right here matters a ton because no matter what you see on YouTube, no matter what I share here on YouTube, you can't take anything that I say or anyone else on the internet says as like advice for yourself, because we have to take into account the entire financial picture, which is what I do in every single client scenario that I'm working with. But anyways, as we looked at that, one thing became increasingly obvious. Nearly all of his accumulated wealth was tied directly or indirectly to market performance in some way, shape, or form, right? His 401k was invested in the market. His brokerage was invested in the market. His company stock was tied to the market. So outside of his future pensions and retirement benefits, almost everything he had, everything he spent decades building was exposed to the same underlying risk, right? Now, to be clear, that does not make those assets bad by any stretch of the imagination. I want you to hear me clearly when I say that, right? As an insurance person myself, right? As someone who owns the product myself, as someone who sells the product myself, it's one of those things that I need to be clear that I'm not one of those guys that believes that whole life insurance is the thing that you should put all of your money in and every other asset is terrible. That's not a belief that I hold. I actually believe quite the opposite. Those assets were what allowed him to accumulate a significant amount of wealth and do that over time. Now, the issue wasn't the quality of the assets. The issue was the concentration, right? Again, that's all he had, and that's all he's accumulated. And he realized that once he had that click of, wait, the stock market has gone up and down. It has made me stressed and it has made me happy. It will make me even more stressed and maybe not even more happy once I enter into a retirement phase of life when that's the primary source of the income that he's generating. So I digress. Now, this is something that I personally have noticed in repeated conversations with successful savers, right? Early in life, the focus is on accumulation. Of course, makes sense. People ask questions like, how much can I save? How much can I invest? How quickly can I grow my assets? And I think that matters, right? Those are really important questions, but eventually the questions begin to change, right? They begin to change to how much of my future retirement income depends on market performance. That's a really big question because that's something that we can't predict. So what happens if the first several years of retirement coincide with a very difficult market environment? You could be in a really bad situation if that were the case. How much volatility am I willing to tolerate? This is a question that needs to be asked and answered of yourself. How much volatility am I willing to tolerate once I'm no longer earning a paycheck? Do I have enough stability built into my overall strategy? Right? That's another important question to answer, right? These are very different questions than the ones people are asking in their 20s and in their 30s and maybe in their early 40s while they're actively accumulating their wealth. And so the engineer that I was working with, he wasn't worried because he had a lack of assets. That was not his worry. He was concerned because he recognized, right? He recognized that a large account balance, right? A large account balance and a retirement strategy are not the same thing, okay? That right there is the important distinction. And by the way, one of the things that I've learned is that people often approach retirement from very different perspectives, okay? And so some people are primarily focused on creating future retirement income. Some people are focused more on liquidity and flexibility. Others are more legacy and wealth transfer oriented. And so if you specifically are trying to determine which of these priorities best describes you, I put together a short assessment that can help you kind of figure that out. And so you can find that in the description below. Now, back to the conversation. Now, many people assume that once they've reached a certain number, the planning is completely finished, okay? Now, in reality, reaching a large number often introduces a new set of considerations. The larger the portfolio becomes, the more important it can be to start thinking about where future retirement income is going to be coming from, how much flexibility exists within the plan. That one matters a whole lot, okay? And whether all of the assets are responding to the same economic forces, right? And so he had that thought, right? He may not have thought of it in that way. My client had this thought though. He's thinking through the lens of, okay, I got my 401k, that puppy's maxed out, still maxing it out. Okay, I got my brokerage account. I got these various assets that are all tied to the market, and yet all of them were responding to the same economic forces. Even if they were slightly invested in different things, generally speaking, the market goes up and down, ebbs and flows in the same pattern. And he realized that, and that was something that he wanted to remove some of the risk off of the table in order to account for what the future will hold for him and having something stable that's not tied to the ebbs and flows and the ups and downs of the market. So what ultimately attracted him The whole life insurance wasn't the promise of maximizing returns. That's not the point of whole life insurance. Whole life insurance is not an investment, okay? It was the opportunity to create a portion of his financial life that wasn't dependent on stock market performance. He wanted stability. What he wanted was liquidity. What he wanted was flexibility, okay? And so most importantly, he wanted to know that if markets became volatile, right, if they went crazy during his retirement years, he would have another asset available to help him weather those periods without being forced to exclusively rely on market-based investment, right? And I would say this word forced here matters a lot, because when you have a quality of life that you've become accustomed to and you're in a retirement phase of life, it's going to be really hard to just like tail that back like all of a sudden at the flip of a switch, right? If anything, you could probably try to figure out the 3-4 years leading up to retirement, how you can kind of start to scale back or whatever. But most people don't even want to have to do that. And so a lot of people are finding themselves in a situation where they are going to be forced to have to rely exclusively on market-based assets. And then they're going to be forced to have to change their lifestyle as a result of that as well. And that's not going to be a happy place to be in, which is why everybody needs something safe in their portfolio. Okay. Just wanted to make sure I kind of pound the drum on that one, that everyone needs something safe in the portfolio. But anyways, in many ways, he reviewed it as a buffer for volatility. He viewed it as a volatility buffer, not as a replacement for his existing assets, not an alternative to investing, because again, whole life insurance is not an investment. He didn't want to do it as an attempt to beat the market, outpace the market. He was doing it as a complement to what he's already built. And I think this is where many discussions about whole life insurance kind of miss the mark, if I'm being frank, right? People often compare it exclusively against investments. They're comparing it to investments. But I'm like, guys, that's like comparing apples and spaghetti. They're completely different asset classes altogether, right? It just should not be a comparison that's made whatsoever, right? And so people are comparing it exclusively against investments and evaluate it based on the growth aspect of it alone. Now, don't get me wrong, growth matters, right? It absolutely matters. Many of the people I work with are evaluating an entirely different set of factors though. They're thinking about stability. They're thinking about future income diversification. They're thinking about liquidity. They're thinking about flexibility, okay? They're thinking about how retirement might feel if markets don't cooperate exactly the way they need it to when they really need it to, okay? So those concerns don't typically show up when someone's looking at a spreadsheet in their peak earning years, right? They often emerge when retirement begins to feel real and the consequences of volatility becomes very easier to imagine. And so one of the biggest questions I've learned from these conversations is that successful retirement planning is rarely about maximizing one single variable. There's so many components that comes with maximizing retirement outcomes, right? It's about balance. That's really the conversation that we should be having, is like, what is the balance? What's the trade-off that you're willing to take, right? Or are there any trade-offs that you need to take in order to optimize the end result, right? So these are the questions that we have to kind of think through and get to a conclusion about. Because don't get me wrong, growth matters, stability matters, flexibility matters, liquidity matters, like all these things matter that goes into the fact that it's not just a one single variable about the size of the 401k balance, the size of the IRA balance or anything like that. There's that and other factors that include what I just listed here. Now, the challenge though is figuring out how those pieces fit together within your own situation. And so the engineer that I worked with didn't move forward with a whole life insurance policy because he believed 401k was going to be a big mistake, right? He moved forward because he wanted additional confidence that his future retirement wasn't dependent upon a single type of asset behaving exactly as expected when he really needs it most, okay? And frankly, I think that there is the real question. Not whether a large 401k balance is good or bad. It's not about whether it's good or bad. It's not about even if whole life insurance is better or worse. That's not really the question that we're getting at. It's about whether the assets that you've accumulated are positioned to support the kind of retirement you actually want to experience, okay? And so at some point, the conversation stops being about how much you've accumulated and it starts becoming more about how resilient is your overall financial plan, okay? How resilient is your overall future cash flow plan? How resilient is the distribution plan? That is where the conversation should reside. And that's often where a very different type of planning begins. Because one of the things that I've learned after years of conversations like this is that not everyone needs the same solution. It's just not true. I've seen it time and time again where there's slight variations to every single person's scenario because everyone has different starting points from an age perspective to the amount of money they have accumulated to the things that they value the most. Everyone has different starting points. But everyone benefits from understanding what they're actually trying to accomplish. And so some people are looking for more stability once again. Some people are looking for maybe a higher level of liquidity. Some people are focused more on retirement income like my client here. Others are caring maybe a little bit more about legacy. And so if you're trying to figure out which path makes the most sense for your specific situation, I've put together a short assessment that may help you identify what your starting point is, and you can find that below. So thanks for watching the video. I hope this was helpful. I hope it got you to kind of think a little bit more about, okay, it's not just about the balance, but about the stability, about the flexibility, about the optionalities that I'm looking for. And if you want to see more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.